Hello everyone, this is Darcinova here. This is a video by yours truly. For those of you who are subscribed to me, you know who Captain Fordo is. If you don't know who he is, I suggest you watch his two-part series on why TCW does not fit in Legends. Now, the reason why I'm doing another video response is not because I'm trying to debunk everything he says. I agree. I'm doing this because, for those of you who are paying attention to my reviews, I'm getting very close to the Clone Wars era myself, and I want to know how am I going to solve this mess of a timeline, because if I'm going to review this and read it, it's going to be, I don't know. I have the beginning of the Clone Wars timeline figured out, and the end, for the most part, figured out. I'm talking about after, the Dark Rendezvous, and etc. But the one I'm trying to figure out, what's frustrating for me, is trying to fit the Clone Wars into this. Because the thing about the Clone Wars is, if you put the Clone Wars at the beginning of the timeline, it's frustrating, because then you cram half of the multimedia project into the span of 2 months, which doesn't make sense. It cannot work from a storytelling perspective, no matter how many half-ass retcons Lilin Chi and Hidalgo came up with. There's nothing that makes sense of this. If you put it towards the end of the timeline, it makes no sense either. It makes a lot more sense because Anakin's a Jedi Knight. Now, for those of you who are watching this video, I'm going to make this clear. This is about Clone Wars fitting into the Legends timeline. I'm going to repeat myself. Legends. If you don't follow the expanded universe, or you never followed it, and you only follow the movies and the Clone Wars, this doesn't apply to you, and you can click away from this video. For those of you who are fans of the TCW and you're fans of the expanded universe, there's something you got to accept, that the Clone Wars just doesn't fit in the timeline. No matter how many retcons Lilin Chi and Hidalgo come up with, it doesn't make sense. Even the official timelines I've looked at for the Clone Wars, in the Reader's Companion, various fan sites, it doesn't make sense to me. And as far as I know, can't comment on the Dark Horse Omnibus, but later editions of these stories do not talk about when these take place in the Clone Wars. In the original printing of the Star Wars Republic comic, the Battle of Kamino takes place 1 month after the Battle of Geonosis. Of course, it would take place even if you take TCW into consideration. But the problem with this is you cram the first 7 volumes of this series into 2 months worth of stories, and that includes half of the multimedia project. It makes no sense putting those stories into a 2-month time frame. It makes even less sense than Han and Leia and Luke, going on adventures every single day and not having time to go to the bathroom. So no matter what you do with this, Anakin, Obi-Wan, all the Jedi involved in the Clone Wars never had a chance to even go to the bathroom in the Clone Wars, because this is how many stories that take place. My solution, at least I consider it, is have the Clone Wars be S-canon, just like Captain Fordo suggested. And the retcon itself heavily implies that anyways, but there's no confirmation one way or another from Lilin Chi, in the Legends timeline, what's its canon status. And even if you consider TCW part of the expanded universe, which I've only loosely consider it part of it, at least the first 5 seasons, is because there's so many contradictions. And I'm going to bring this up later in the video on why it's a big deal for EU fans, the Clone Wars not fitting in Legends. If you're trying to make sense of the Clone Wars timeline, it's a mess. If you put TCW in the first 2 months of the war, it makes no sense. Because you cram about almost 3 years worth of stories into 2 months. But if you move TCW towards the end of the timeline, which that's what I'm doing, because it makes more sense. I'd rather have the Clone Wars take place in the unrealistic time frame than the multimedia project. It still makes no sense, because there's still contradictions. The only way to make sense of the Clone Wars is to view it as a in-universe holodrama. It just doesn't make sense, and if you're trying to read everything chronologically like I am, it's a fucking nightmare. And I'm going to bring up a point that I think the Scoundrels Cantina doesn't seem to get. It does matter to us, those who value continuity, who want everything to fit together, that Clone Wars doesn't fit in Legends. George Lucas was not involved in the Clone Wars as much as you guys want to believe. And I know you did a video as a response to Captain Fordo's latest video. His video proves beyond a reasonable doubt that the Clone Wars just doesn't fit. And no amount of retconning will do that. And do we really trust the words of a bully, Papa Hidalgo, who wrote this? I don't follow his Clone Wars timeline. It makes no sense to me. The reason why I'm bringing this up, the Reader's Companion, because the Reader's Companion is essentially the closest thing we have to a complete timeline when it comes to the expanded universe. Okay, I'm just showing you it a bit. Okay, the start of the timeline is, of course, Attack of the Clones. Duh. But, the first few Boba Fett novels, take place during the start of the Clone Wars. Of course, here's the thing that makes no sense. Originally, Secret of the Jedi takes place, later in the war, but or History of the Jedi, whatever. But it's placed towards the beginning of the war, even though it's in the middle. It makes no sense, all because of TCW. The Crucius Deception is supposed to take place 12 months after the war begins, but according to the Reader's Companion, it's 22 BBBY. Now, it makes no sense for Heroes' Trials supposed to take place towards the end of the war, despite the fact it takes place, towards the, about 6 months before the events of Revenge of the Sith. But 6 to 7 months. This stuff is in this book, by the way. And Secrets of the Jedi, it takes place before the events of TCW, despite the fact it takes place towards the end of the war. Now, why am I bringing this up, and why is this important? Because it shows you how little sense that even Hidalgo himself in this. Oh, you have a bunch of stories that take place 2 months prior to the Clone Wars. You got me? So, Anakin Skywalker and all this did nearly 3 years worth of battles, 3 years worth of experiences in 2 months. That makes no sense. Now, if you view TCW and the Multimedia Project as separate entities, it makes complete sense that TCW is in its own universe and the Multimedia Project is part of the Legends continuity. This is not an attack on TCW. I'm just saying that trying to make this fit, this point is ludicrous to me. Yes, I'm aware that putting TCW towards the end of the war causes problems, but it causes less problems than placing it towards the beginning of the war. 2 months after Anakin gets knighted, that's when it's supposed to take place. Now, It makes no sense for Anakin to have a Padawan for a few months and then have her never be mentioned again, but I'm not going to get into that can of worms. It doesn't even count for all the hard-to-find junior novels and comics. This timeline is confusing. So, when I do my reviews, I'm going to have my own Clone Wars timeline, following the Multimedia Project, and trying to ignore TCW as much as possible. Now, I'm just going to view it as Imperial propaganda, but you can't use that excuse for the tie-in material, which is the problem I have with those who defend, TCW staying in Legends. Okay, you have a point. If we remove TCW, it has problems. Because then you have to remove a bunch of material that's tied to it. But here's another problem. If you're going to say that TCW is Imperial propaganda, then what about the stories that are tied to it? All the comics, are you going to tell me that's Imperial propaganda too? That doesn't work. The solution is have it all be S-canon. Wild Space makes sense that it takes place towards the end of the timeline. Of course, Republic Commando, the first one, originally it's supposed to take place towards the first few months of the war. It's supposed to take place before Heroes Trial and Shatterpoint, but because of TCW, that book is moved before those events. Even I'm sorry, it is frustrating. Hard Contact should take place before the events of Heroes Trial, because that's how it was created. But with TCW, it has to take place after. Of course, Shatterpoint taking place after Heroes Trial, I don't think it's a big deal, but it was never meant to take place towards the beginning of the war. I mean, I'm sorry. The Clone Wars makes my brain melt sometimes when I'm trying to piece together this timeline. No More Prisoners, again, it makes no sense for it to take place in the part of the timeline it does. This is why the Clone Wars timeline can be very frustrating if you're trying to piece everything together. That's why I'm saying that the events at the beginning of the war, if you're following it based on the Multimedia Project, it's much easier to follow. But if you include TCW, you have a choice, a hard one to make. Do you have it take place towards the beginning of the war, which makes no goddamn sense, and the Reader's Companion, no matter how fucking much Hidalgo explains the mess that is the Clone Wars era because of TCW, it still makes no goddamn sense. This isn't a rant on the show. Again, this is a rant about how little the timeline makes sense and people not accepting facts. That until there is an official timeline, I'm going to make up my own timeline, using the Multimedia Project as a base. Now, some people who don't like TCW think it's foolish for me to try to incorporate it into the timeline. I don't want to completely throw out the Clone Wars. There's some good material in the show. But I'm trying to make sense of this whole fucking thing, because to me it's much more enjoyable if I'm reading a coherent timeline. So, those who say that it doesn't matter if it contradicts it or not, it does, actually. Because if we're fighting for Legends, it kills the credibility because people can point, people constantly say there's contradictions, and they can just point their finger at the Clone Wars. It doesn't take much effort to find contradictions that the Clone Wars caused. The Clone Wars, contradicts the entire Republic Commando series, which established, the clones. Yet only ARC troopers have the ability to be independent. Yet TCW have regular clone troopers be able to think for themselves and actually betray the Republic. It makes no sense if you try to incorporate both. Now, if you consider the Clone Wars S canon or an in-universe holodrama that was made 100 years after the Clone Wars, that could explain away the contradictions. I'm pretty sure I'd put a lot more effort coming up with something interesting like that than they have. I'm not saying that, you should disregard it completely. That's up to you. Another solution would be just to throw it out. But then again, another thing that I think that if they wanted to include the Clone Wars, I think would have made a lot more sense if this, I can't believe I am even bringing this up. The Clone Wars, they extend the conflict of the Clone Wars from 3 years to 5 or 6. But then that would kind of mess with the timeline a bit. Honestly, that really would cause some serious problems. I don't know. It's just, the Clone Wars makes no sense, the timeline. And unlike Matt Wilkins, me, I don't have the patience to try to fit all this time material, the Clone Wars TV series, into the span of 2 months. So, I suggest, other than making an S canon, so it has some legitimacy in Legends, and so some of those stories, like Darth Plagueis, the Fate of the Jedi novels, don't have S canon references, that the events of the series could have happened, but not in the way that they were portrayed in the show. And maybe Ahsoka did exist, but maybe she wasn't Anakin's Padawan. That's just my thoughts on it. This isn't an angry rant like some of you were expecting. I'm sorry. This is just my thoughts on it. When I get to that point in my reviews, I'm going to make up my own timeline using the Multimedia Project. And I'm going to go from there. I'm not going to review everything regarding the Clone Wars era material. I'll be fucking reviewing the Clone Wars material until the freaking cows come home, and not to mention, I'm not going to spend $200 on a bunch of material that I'm probably never going to touch again. I don't believe in piracy. I believe in buying all my stuff legitimately unless there's no other option. So yeah, that's my take on the Clone Wars timeline. This is Darcinovia, over and out. May the Force be with you. I'm sorry for the quality. There's nothing I can do. It's the best I can work with until I get a better mic and webcam. Later.